Welcome to Clarity, a podcast powered by the Thomson Reuters Institute. I'm Zach Warren, the Institute's Technology and Innovation Insights Lead. In each episode, we dive deep into a single question from decision makers and thought leaders from legal, corporate, tax accounting and audit, and government communities. In today's episode, we discuss the big question: how are courts navigating staffing, operations, and technology? In the immediate weeks and months after the COVID-19 pandemic, many observers said that the U.S. court system may forever be changed. Courts were moving virtual, bringing in new technologies, and still needed to tackle a large case backlog. But fast forward 5 years and many court issues still persist. There are issues with court staffing levels, less than efficient operations, and an ever-widening budget and time crunch. But with all of that said, there is hope of an access to justice revolution. From a recent report on the state of the courts from the Thomson Reuters Institute and the National Center for State Courts, TRI's Rabia Butler sits down with David Slayton, Executive Officer and Clerk of Court for the Superior Court of Los Angeles County, and Andrea Miller, Senior Research Associate at the National Center for State Courts, to discuss the present and the future of U.S. courts.
Hello, I'm your host, Rabia Butler, and today on Clarity, we seek to provide some insight into a very specific question. How are courts navigating staffing and operations and technology in this day and age? Today, we are accompanied by David Slayton, Executive Officer and Clerk of the Court for the Superior Court of Los Angeles County, as well as Andrea Miller, the Senior Research Associate at the National Center for State Courts. They will help us discuss the findings of the latest report from Thomson Reuters Institute in association with the National Center for State Courts, Staffing and Operations and Technology. If you haven't had the time to read this report, it provides some in-depth explanation of some of the things we'll be discussing today. In this episode, we'll investigate the reasons behind the judiciary's slow embrace of AI technology and what hesitation signifies for the future of the justice system. From staffing shortages to operational inefficiencies, we'll unravel the major trends shaping the court system today and discover how digital transformation is set to revolutionize access to justice. We'll also spotlight the transformative power of generative AI in the court's operations, assessing its potential to enhance efficiency and tackle workforce challenges head on. Our conversation will touch on the impact of staffing crisis on justice and accessibility, the delicate balance between technology adaptation and equitable access to justice, the challenges legal professionals face in achieving work-life balance, as well as budget constraints that are looming, and discussing the strategies for prioritizing modernization efforts in order to maximize the impact with limited resources. Welcome.
Thank you. It's
Good
great to be
morning.
here.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm great. So I'm going to ask you guys just some very specific questions. I know you guys have both had some opportunities to take a look at the report. And one of the major themes of the report is staffing, and that there are certain crises currently in staffing. In this report, 68% of respondents experienced staffing shortages in the past year, and 61% expect to experience shortages in the coming year. How do these shortages, in your opinion, impact the access to justice? And what solutions are courts implementing to manage workloads while maintaining this quality of service?
Yeah, I'll take a shot at this. Good morning, and thanks so much. Thanks for having us here as part of this important discussion, especially right now. As you point out, courts across the country are reporting staffing shortages, especially in court clerk roles. We in LA, the Superior Court of Los Angeles County, the largest consolidated trial court in the country, we're not immune from this. It's interesting, despite the fact that there may be a need in the workforce for positions. For some reason, we continue to have issues filling those. I know here at our court, we pretty much run consistently about 500 vacancies. We have about 5,000 court employees. So it's about a 10% vacancy rate. And that's, from people promoting or people retiring. A lot of our workforce in the courts are nearing retirement age. And so replacing them with workers entering the workforce is an important challenge. But obviously, from the results from the survey and the report, we all see this as a big problem for us. And of course, it's a problem that I think the survey reflects. I think 61% saying we expect this to continue. It's a challenge to continue to think about how we get people to enter into our workforce. So it's we have to be creative in the way we do that, but at the same time, as the report points out, we're facing challenges. What this means is that the report points out that staff don't think they have enough time to meet their demands, and they're working more hours to get the work done. So that's producing burnout, and so I think it really emphasizes the need for us to not only focus on recruitment and retention, but also process automation and using modern tools that can support our workforce to make them more efficient with using technology so that they're not experiencing the overload of workload. I know for us, we're consistently struggling to try to make sure that we can stay on top of the work and that we don't have backlogs in the work. And we're oftentimes offering people comp time or overtime to be able to come in and work on evenings and weekends just to keep up. So it's a challenge. And I think it's incumbent upon us as court leaders to really think about how technology can help us with this problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what I'm seeing from my position at NCSC, um, which gives me the benefit of seeing what's going on in courts kind of all across the country, and what David's talking about in LA is really spot on with what we're seeing nationwide. I think there's a lot of focus in the conversation about AI and other technologies right now. There's a lot of focus on Gen AI specifically. There's a lot of talk about how lawyers and judges might be using Gen AI to help write documents or inform their decisions. And that's understandable because Chat GPT is right in front of us as an example every day, and it seems like there's always a new headline about Chat GPT. But I think it's important to remember that most court staff aren't doing that kind of legal research or drafting long documents with legal information as part of their day-to-day work. And the places where I've been seeing the most understaffing are exactly the kinds of positions that David's talking about. The kinds of positions that are involved in case flow processing, moving those cases through the system from filing to whatever kind of management has to happen post disposition. And so that's going to be roles like your clerks who are doing a lot of that case flow processing, but then also doing a lot of the interfacing with court users and helping those court users navigate the courts. So understaffing in these positions has a huge impact on access to justice and the court user experience. And then it also contributes to burnout and turnover and all of those concerns with work-life balance that David's talking about. And so I think luckily there are a lot of opportunities to innovate with technology and AI and other types of automation to address these problems. So, there's a lot of case flow tasks that involve a lot of repetitive manual labor. That's a good place to start. So, just to give kind of a concrete example for the audience to think about, when a case is initially filed, usually there's a human who has to kind of manually read through all those forms and all those documents, right? They're checking that the administrative requirements are met. Is the stamp in the right place? Is the date in the right place, right? They're checking whether service requirements were met, whether the correct case type is on there. Is this a small claims or a regular claims? They might be manually entering data into the case management system based on those forms. They might be making decisions about directing the case to the right docket and the right calendar, assigning a judge, figuring out that judge is on vacation that month, and then assigning a new judge, right? There's all these little tasks just involved in that initial filing process that are often very manual. And there's so much opportunity in that kind of work that isn't necessarily about Gen AI, but other kinds of AI and automation that really gives us an opportunity to address understaffing by reducing that workload. And by doing that, we can really free up the time of all these great staff members we have in the courts to devote their time to things like helping self-represented litigants and doing other more kind of complex and interesting tasks that actually really need that human touch. Right now, essentially, we are developing resources at NCSC to help the courts identify some of those specific points in their workflow that could benefit from technology innovation. And a big impact, hopefully, of that work will be to start to address some of these understaffing issues.
And it's interesting, in your example, you talked about uh, doing more complex or more meaningful work. In the survey, we were actually seeing that inefficiency of certain tasks correlates with the errors. So, creating these more efficient tasks or more efficient processes also seems like it's going to decrease the error rate, promoting access to justice. Is that the feeling you guys are getting?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it can be very tempting to see a new technology like ChatGPT and and to say, "Oh wow, this technology is so great. Where can we start using this? Where can we plug this in?" But we really want to equip courts to be able to start by defining the problem first, like understaffing, and where are the points in the workflow where there are these higher error rates. Where are we getting where does missing data in the case management system come from? What's the original source in our process that led to those error rates? And once the courts can specifically identify those challenges, then it's time to start asking the questions. Okay, what technology solutions might start addressing those challenges? And so, we really want to get courts to the point of having the resources available to them, and the AI knowledge and capacity to be able to start from those problems and find solutions, as opposed to um, seeing all these flashy new technologies that are coming out in the world and saying, where should we plug this in?
Yeah, I agree completely with Andrea on this. The some of the most common places where people where there are errors. I think some people, listeners, may not understand really some of the manual work and duplicate data entry that's happening still in courts. And as, for instance, data entry into the case management system, the brains of all of this, all of what's going on within the court system is the case management system. And what we see a lot, even with electronic filing these days, is a lot of duplicate data entry and manual data entry. And some people may think that just because it's being filed electronically, that all of that is just being automated into the system. And there is some of that happening, but in lots of ways, I think we've used e-filing to be an electronic delivery system, but we've not really achieved the full benefits of seeing it truly electronically entered. And even if it was, making sure that the user that's filing the document has entered it correctly is another issue. So really, there's a lot of this where we can use technology to look at issues and make sure we're trying to reduce those errors. I think the other issue is, these repetitive tasks, as Andrea was mentioning, sort of what I'll call sort of high friction, but really doesn't require a ton of real thinking, and real deep thinking to really think about these documents and making sure, and other entries, making sure that they're error free. A lot of those are, they're sort of repetitive, and so staff might get into a lull of just sort of accept, or enter, and miss some error that shows up. And so it's a real challenge. And of course, when those errors occur, there are downstream impacts of that, whether it's other judicial officers or other staff that are using that information, or litigants or the public who are seeking information, finding those errors. And so, obviously, our thought is and hope is that we can leverage the power of technology to help us to spot errors. Maybe it doesn't actually fix the error, but at least spot the errors and provide information to staff to assist them in making sure those don't come up. And then hopefully even eliminating some duplicate data entry. We'll even see instances where the same staff within a court will enter data multiple times because of different systems not connecting properly. So, there's a lot of work we can do here that will free up our teams to really focus on the higher value work that really serves the public. As Andrew was mentioning, for instance, self-help and other areas. I don't know if I think we'll probably talk about this at some point. There's not a court in the country that's saying, "Oh my goodness, our budgets are too big. We can't possibly figure out what to do with all this money. Most of us are struggling just to maintain our constitutional responsibilities and statutory responsibilities, and just sort of struggling to get by with that. So if we can figure out ways to reduce some of these more routine issues and error prone issues, and allow our staff to focus on some of the other areas where we think we really could provide a better service to the public, then we all win in that situation.
Okay, so before we get to the budget, because I know that's going to be a very interesting topic, let's talk a little bit about the technology adoption gap. While virtual hearings are used pretty widely, and it's found that they're for your earlier hearings, such as your pretrial hearings, your motions hearings, and things like that, a digital divide seems to be affecting litigant participation. Do you think courts can balance the technological progress with equitable access to justice?
Yeah, I'll start there. If we take just go back 5 years, just over 5 years ago, most courts didn't have virtual hearings. We had some phone-in hearings, but on March the 13th of 2020, when the pandemic hit the country and the national emergency was declared, courts immediately realized the need to transition to virtual hearings, and so within a matter of days and weeks, courts all across the country and all across the world had transitioned to virtual hearings. But basically, there was really no planning that went into that. There were some courts that had been looking at it and maybe some pilots, but for the most part, we just had to do it because it was the only way to provide access to justice during the pandemic. And so, we've seen lots of great positives, and we could talk probably a whole episode about the positives of virtual hearings and how it's really helped people gain access to justice in ways they weren't able to prior to the pandemic and in-person hearings. But we can't take our eye off the ball that there are digital access issues, and I'll just point out a couple of them. One of them is just really digital literacy. Not everyone knows how to appear in a virtual hearing, even if they are familiar with virtual hearing platforms. That doesn't mean that they understand. If you think about in the pre-pandemic, the pre-virtual hearing days, people walked into courthouses and there was usually someone at the clerk's office or an information booth to answer a question, say, where do I go? What do I do? What does this mean? And lots of times now people are just entering into a courtroom and there's the judge. And so there's some issues with even the digital literacy side of things. Even if they know how to use the platforms, they still struggle with our platforms and how to do that. Obviously, there's issue of people having devices. Do they have the right devices? Do they have cameras and microphones and unlimited data on their phones to be able to, or devices to be able to connect? So that's obviously a challenge, I think, for us as we go forward. And then connectivity. There are places in the country still where connectivity is a real challenge. And with the mobile, the way our folks are mobile all across the country, depending on where they're at when they need to appear in a hearing, that's a challenge for them. And oftentimes the people facing the steepest barriers, as the survey, as the report points out, are the self-represented litigants who are not represented by an attorney and are seeking to gain access. And so we have to really keep our eyes on that. And I think ultimately our goal is technology shouldn't widen the gap in access to justice. Not to say it didn't exist before, but we need to make sure that we're keeping our eye on the fact that we don't want to make that situation work. So here in the Superior Court of Los Angeles County, we're really trying to prioritize digital equity, doing things such as simplifying user interfaces. We're looking to expand remote kiosk across the county, and I know other courts are doing this. And then putting out videos and trying to help people understand, the basics of how to interface with the court in a virtual hearing. And then we're providing help desk support. So we have a phone number that litigants can call if they're having issues. I know an example from the UK that actually was pre-pandemic. They started doing some virtual hearings pre-pandemic, and something we're looking at closely that they did and still do is they provide a check-in for litigants the day before the hearing. So a virtual hearing check-in. So people can test out, is everything working? So the anxiety that oftentimes comes with appearing in a hearing generally, but even more anxiety that comes with people trying to do that remotely, can be resolved with a quick check-in with a clerk the day before. But we could use technology to assist with that. It doesn't require a person on the other side. So I think there's lots of opportunities that we can use to try to make sure that people don't have those issues with virtual hearings.
I love that example, David, and I totally agree with everything that you just said. I think um, it is absolutely true that we need to be thinking about accessibility differences and digital divides when we're talking about technologies, but that's not a reason not to innovate. That's just a reason to innovate very thoughtfully and very well. Um, so I think that when it comes to virtual hearings specifically, one of the things that we've been doing at NCSC, for example, is we redesigned our court tools access and fairness survey a couple years ago, which is the survey that a lot of courts use to get feedback directly from court users about how accessible and fair they perceive the courts to be after their court business. And the new version of the survey essentially asks the court users whether they completed their court business online remotely or in person, so that we can specifically take a look and see, are the accessibility ratings differing between the in-person and the remote settings. And so far, all the courts I've worked with have either found either no difference in accessibility ratings between those two settings, or they found that remote court users view the courts as more accessible. So I think that's a really positive sign that, generally speaking, on average, for most people, having remote options in addition to in-person options is helping and not hurting in terms of accessibility. But of course, then we need to be really concerned, as David was talking about those more vulnerable, more marginalized groups of court users who have more barriers to accessibility. And I think what I've been seeing so far in the data is that it tends to be the same groups of people who face accessibility barriers in person that then also face accessibility barriers in remote settings. So I haven't yet seen evidence that the remote court proceedings are creating problems for a whole new group of people that weren't already struggling before. So we definitely need to work with all the courts to address whatever those barriers are for those groups of people. But I think that we can do that in tandem with technology innovations, and actually technology can be used as a solution to address those barriers. So for example, just looking at our access and fairness survey data for some of the courts that I've worked with, we check for things like age and race and gender differences in those accessibility ratings. And we sometimes see lower ratings of accessibility among younger court users on average, court users of color, and trans and non-binary court users. Those are the three groups that tend to come up pretty consistently in different courts as having more barriers to accessibility. And so far, those barriers have looked the same for those groups, whether they're in person or remote. So we need to address those court users' needs, but I don't think it's necessarily the remote proceedings that are the problem in those cases. So I think in terms of strategies, I think there's really two big ones. First is participant-centered design, right? Whenever we're implementing a new technology, or even just updating a court process or procedure, even if we're just updating a court form or something like that, we should always be talking to court users about their needs and experiences, and especially those court users that have historically experienced the most accessibility barriers. And we need to just make sure that we're always carefully designing those new innovations to meet their needs. And the second big strategy here, I think, is data and evaluation. So I know that I'm expected to say that as the researcher, but I will always say that it's really important that we're collecting data whenever we're innovating a new process, to make sure that it's effective, make sure that it's accessible, make sure it's meeting the goals we started out with. And then after it's launched, it's really important to keep collecting data every once in a while, maybe every year or two, to monitor that ongoing performance.
So there are two issues that I want to kind of make sure we get to before the end. The first one is the budgetary one we were talking about. Considering that the technology gaps persist and investment budgets may be limited, how do courts prioritize modernization efforts to achieve the greatest impact with minimal resources?
Yeah, I think this is a bit of a chicken and the egg quandary that we find ourselves in. We want to see, and I think the report points out that courts are expecting to see tremendous benefits of this. I think the survey said 8.8 hours per week per staff member within 5 years. That is huge. I mean, that's over 20% of the time that staff are spending if they're working a 40-hour week. And so, but at the same time, only 17% of the courts are using it. So I think courts are recognizing huge value. So how do courts invest in that at the same time they're having to, having challenges with meeting the budget generally? So I think it's, we've got to work together collaboratively. We have courts all across the country that are doing very innovative things, including my own court where I'm at. I know we're doing some very interesting things with AI, and we need to be sharing those things that we're learning, leaning on our private partners that support many of the court's case management systems and other things to get them to invest in this area, and then looking for new partners out there to help us. I think it's important that to realize that this is a huge investment, and again, it's not just for us internally. It's actually in improving the public service that we can provide. So it's again, we've got to sort of keep our eye on the future at the same time focusing on the challenges we have today. And I think it's a bit of a difficult thing, but I think we all need to realize that some investment now goes a long way in the future. And so trying to convince funders of that is important as well, so that legislators or counties or cities or whoever it is that's funding the court can really see the value of providing a small investment. Maybe it's even a one-time investment to allow courts to really jump ahead, and this will make big differences in the long run. Again, if we could give 8.8 hours per week per staff member back to them to focus on other areas, again, as we've talked earlier in the podcast, that just dramatically improves our ability to provide access to justice.
Absolutely. I totally agree. And I think that one of the things David mentioned was this idea of courts coming together to really pool their resources. I think at NCSC, that's really our big role in the court sector, right? Is to do that bridging and uniting of the courts so that we can really pool all that knowledge. For a lot of the courts that are just getting started now and don't really know where to start, there's a lot of legwork that they need to do just to be able to get to the point to start thinking about specific cool new applications and tools. So things like having an internal AI use policy, having an AI governance committee or structure of some kind, building up the AI expertise and IT infrastructure in-house. That's a lot of legwork that needs to be done, a lot of data governance work behind the scenes that courts don't necessarily have time to do when they just need to get their regular court business done every single day. And so that's really one of the big impacts we're hoping to have, is to bring courts together across the court sector to do a lot of that legwork together so every court isn't putting in all that labor separately. So just to give one example, we have a big project that we're working on right now called AI readiness for the state courts. We've been working together with a lot of the courts that are already using technologies in really advanced and sophisticated ways to develop guidance and really pass along all that valuable knowledge and experience for the courts that are just getting started. And so we're hoping that that will help get courts over that kind of first, where do we start barrier. So, for example, that's resources like templates for an internal AI policy, guidance on how to structure the AI governance committee, a roadmap and a process for identifying those specific points in the workflow that could be improved with technology, guidance on how to vet and negotiate with technology vendors, change management resources, right? These are all the things that when we build up the knowledge there, they're going to be relevant for every court. So why have every court figure that out all by themselves? Through the Thomson Reuters Institute, we've also been offering a lot of webinars and educational resources, right? That's also part of that kind of pooled knowledge base. So this is information and legwork and kind of infrastructure building work that would take each court a lot of time and money to do individually. But when we bring the courts together to kind of pool all those resources, we can really lower the startup cost, hopefully for all the courts.
And if I can add one thing I should have mentioned, we here in LA and a couple other counties here in California are, building all of our tools now on what's referred to as CourtStack. And if you go to courtstack.org, you can learn more about it. But the value of that, to Andrew's point about, reinforcing my point about sharing, basically anyone using can use those tools no matter what their case management system. Basically there's two case management systems that have been programmed in there, but you could do more. And quite frankly, if you're using two of the major case management systems that most courts use, you don't have to do anything. You could install this and run those programs. And so, the goal is sort of plug and play for courts all over the country. And I think that's a way that we can help each other get to where we want to go with technology.
So I know we're coming to the end, but I'd be remiss if I didn't take this a little bit from the business of being a court to the business of being an employer. An observation worth noting is that legal professionals often work these extended hours without feeling like they have sufficient time to meet their obligations. What systemic changes could be implemented to address this issue? And just what your top one would be?
Well, I think, we've talked a little bit about this, but, um, as we think about as an employer, we have multiple generations in the workforce now. We have individuals who are nearing the end of their career after very long, dedicated careers with the court. They're looking, to be as efficient as they can without having to, without at the same time having a work-life balance. But we also have millennials, and those folks are moving into the courts, into leadership. We have Gen Z in the so we have a lot of folks who are really expecting tech forward work environments where we can see efficiencies, and they expect when they show up to see an employer, a workforce, a workplace where technology helps them get their job done, so that they're not having to do a bunch of manual work that's taking a lot of extra time and making them less efficient. And we know that workers in the workforce today really want to make a difference. And that's what they gain their intrinsic value in the workplace from. And if they feel like they're doing things that are from 20, 30, 40 years ago that we had to do manually that we could be using technology for today, I think they see less value. And it sort of goes back to the first question we talked about recruitment and retention. One of the ways that we may struggle with recruitment and retention is that people don't see us as a innovative place to work. And so making sure that we are focusing on the ways that we can make this a workplace where people say, wow, that's a great place to work, that not only can I make a contribution to access to justice, but I get to do it every day in a place that really values my time as a worker, to make best use of my talents. So that's really what I think is important. So, we need to make sure that we're reimagining what a modern court workplace looks like, not just to retain staff, but to make sure we can attract that next generation of justice professionals.
Absolutely. I think that really person-centered, employee-centered technology innovation is really, really key. I think in addition to that, I think the other big systemic change I would point to is all the systemic changes that we need outside of the courts to reduce the amount of cases coming into the courts. I think the state courts typically are the repository for all of society's problems, right? And all the ways in which the systems are failing people. Often that means that they have life circumstances that lead them to end up in court. And so, if we're thinking really big about systemic changes that can help address, the shortage of resources in the courts, some of those big systemic changes are deflection and diversion strategies that prevent some of these cases from ending up in the courts that really could and maybe should be handled by other kinds of community resources. So things like eviction diversion programs, addressing the shortages in mental and behavioral health providers, and community responding to mental health crises, things like that. There's a lot of deflection and diversion initiatives that are happening right now that really need more resources, and can help really make sure that the people and the cases that end up in courts really do need to be in court, and that we're using our court resources where they should be used.
Well, thank you both for your time today. I know I've gotten a lot of information. Again, if you haven't already done so, please take some time, download the report. It's a great read. I don't even think we've really scratched the surface on what's in there. And with the TRI and NCSC consortium, we do have a webinar that'll be out very shortly that'll also discuss this report and give you just a little bit more information. So thank you all for your time, and I hope you all have a great day.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. You too.
Yes.
Thank you to Andrea, David, and Rabia for your insights. I think many people view the court system as an institution where not much has changed since the days of quills and powdered wigs, but in reality, that's just not true. Staffing levels, budgetary concerns, and docket crunches are forcing major changes to how today's courts function. And as our guests reveal, there are likely to be even more technology-powered changes just over the horizon. Thank you as always for joining us for Clarity, powered by the Thomson Reuters Institute. You can follow or subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast platform, and don't forget to share with your colleagues and leave a 5-star review. For more data-driven analysis of today's professional services market and in-depth conversations with industry thought leaders, visit us online at thomsonreuters.com/institute and follow us on LinkedIn under the Thomson Reuters Institute. Clarity is a production of Thomson Reuters, copyright Thomson Reuters 2025.